A man stands in a crowded marketplace. The air is thick dust swirling in golden light. Merchants shouting, coins clinking, life unfolding in the ordinary rhythm of a stable world. Rome, 3rd century. To anyone passing by, this is just another day. Trade flows, people negotiate. Value feels certain, but for him, this moment is different. He has just returned from the frontier. 25 years of war carved into his body. Winters spent in frozen camps. Summers soaked in blood and dust. Loyalty given to an empire that promised stability. In return, and now finally, he holds that promise in his hand. A small leather pouch. Inside silver coins, not just metal, not just currency. These coins represent something deeper. Time, sacrifice, identity. The belief that effort, given long enough, transforms into security. He steps forward and hands one coin to a merchant. The merchant pauses, not dramatically, not suspiciously, just a fraction longer than expected. He turns the coin in his fingers, weighs it, studies it like something slightly unfamiliar. Then he looks up. This isn't what it used to be. The words don't make sense at first. The soldier frowns. Yesterday, this coin had value. Yesterday, it meant something. But yesterday is gone. The merchant slides it back across the table. To light, he says, to mixed, and in that quiet exchange, something invisible fractures. No explosion, no warning, no moment that history books would later underline, just a shift. A silent collapse. Because what the soldier doesn't realize, what almost no one around him realizes, is that the system he trusted has already begun to break. Not through invasion, but from within. The silver in those coins has been diluted, stretched, replaced, little by little, until the symbol of value no longer matches the reality behind it. And the most dangerous part, it didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, so slowly that no one noticed. Until it was too late. Cut a dim apartment in Germany. 1923. A mother sits at a table, staring at stacks of paper money. Her hands tremble not from cold, but from something deeper, helplessness. The currency in front of her could have bought a house a few years ago. Now, it struggles to buy a loaf of bread. Outside, people carry money in wheelbarrows. Inside, she makes a decision that would have been unthinkable before she takes the bills and feeds them into the fire. They burn quickly, brightly. For a brief moment, they provide warmth. Money reduced to fuel, value transformed into survival. And the question lingers in the smoke rising from that fire. If something once so powerful can become so meaningless, what was it really worth to begin with? Cut. A trading floor. New York, 2008. The room is loud, but underneath the noise, there is a strange stillness. Screens flicker, numbers fall, phones ring endlessly, but something is off. The confidence is gone. Traders stare at their monitors not with focus, but with disbelief. Trillions of dollars are vanishing, not stolen, not burned, just erased. Years of growth collapsing into hours, fortunes built over decades dissolving in real time, and yet nothing physical changes. The buildings are still standing, the systems are still running, but the belief that held everything together, that's gone. Cut. A quiet room. Present day. A single person sits alone, staring at a screen. Their finger refreshes an app. Again. Numbers. Rise, fall, rise again. A digital heartbeat of hope and anxiety. But beneath it, something deeper. Pulses. Uncertainty. Because even now, even in a world that feels advanced, stable, controlled, the same pattern exists. Invisible, unnoticed, until it ISN single quotes, and slowly, almost uncomfortably, a question begins to form. Not loud, not urgent, but persistent. If wealth can disappear overnight, what doesn't? Because history doesn't just show collapse, it reveals something far more unsettling, that what we call stability is often just a temporary agreement, a shared belief. And when that belief cracks, everything built on top of it begins to shift. But here's where it becomes even more unsettling. In every collapse, every single one, most people don't just lose money, they lose something far more valuable. Certainty, direction, identity. Because the system they trusted didn't just hold their wealth, it held their understanding of how the world works. And when that system breaks, They don't know where to stand. They hesitate, they wait. They hope things will return to normal. But normal is already gone. And while this is happening, while confusion spreads, while fear rises, something else is happening at the edges, quietly, almost invisibly. A small group of people begins to move, not react, move. They don't panic in the same way. They don't freeze in the same way. They don't cling to what used to work. Instead, they adjust, they reposition, they adapt, and sometimes they thrive, not in spite of collapse, but because of it, which leads to a dangerous, almost uncomfortable realization. It wasn't luck, it wasn't timing, and it wasn't just privilege. It was something else, something harder to see, harder to measure, but undeniably real. Skills, not the kind you list on a resume, not the kind rewarded in stable systems, but deeper, more fundamental abilities, the ability to see patterns before they become obvious, the ability to detach from systems before they collapse, the ability to create value, even when traditional value disappears. These are not taught, at least, not directly, because the systems we grow up in, education, careers, financial structures, are designed for stability. They reward consistency. They encourage specialization. They condition you to believe that if you follow the path, you will be safe. But there's a paradox hidden inside that belief. The more stable a system appears, the less prepared people are when it changes. And systems always change, so the very structure designed to protect you becomes the thing that makes you vulnerable. And this is where the idea begins to take shape. There are skills that depend on systems, and there are skills that exist beyond them. System-bound skills tie you to a specific environment, a specific role, a specific set of rules. Be system-proof skills. They move, they adapt, they survive, across empires, across collapses, across time. And once you begin to see them, you realize something unsettling. They have always been there, hidden in plain sight, repeated across history, ignored during prosperity, revealed during collapse. So the real question isn't whether collapse happens. History has already answered that. The real question is, what do you carry when everything else is taken? Because when systems fail, when currencies lose meaning, when structures dissolve, you are left with one thing: your ability to operate without them. And here's the final, unsettling thought. What if the next collapse doesn't look like collapse at all? What if it feels like progress? What if it's already happening, slowly, quietly, beneath the surface of everyday life? Would you notice, or would you? For permanence, right up until the moment it disappears. History doesn't collapse loudly. It whispers first. It bends, stretches, distorts quietly, almost politely before it finally breaks. And by the time most people hear the sound, it's already over. Rome is the easiest place to begin. Not because it was the first collapse, but because it is one of the clearest. At its peak, Rome was not just an empire. It was a system of belief. Roads connected continents, armies enforced order, currency moved with authority. To live inside Rome was to feel certain. But beneath that certainty, something subtle was happening. Silver coins, once pure, heavy, trusted, began to change. Not all at once, not dramatically. The state started mixing them with cheaper metals. A little at first, then a little more. To the average citizen, nothing seemed different. A coin still looked like a coin. Trade still happened. Markets still functioned. But value was quietly leaking. And this is where the pattern begins. Because collapse rarely removes value, it relocates it. The Roman elite, landowners, political insiders, they held on to what had worked for generations. Land, titles, proximity to power. They believed these things were permanent, but merchants who lived closer to movement than structure noticed the shift sooner. Trade routes changed, trust in currency weakened, so they adapted. They didn't fight the change, they moved with it, and over time, many who once stood at the top found themselves overtaken by those who understood something deeper. Value is not fixed, it flows. Centuries pass, the Byzantine Empire rises, a continuation, in many ways, of Roman stability. Trade dominates. Constantinople becomes the center of global exchange. Goods move across continents. Wealth accumulates in predictable patterns until those patterns begin to shift. External pressures, internal strain, trade routes rerouted, political instability creeping in at the edges. To those inside the system, it still feels stable because systems don't announce their own decay, they normalize it. Merchants, who relied on fixed routes, begin to struggle. But others, less attached to traditions, start to explore new paths, new markets, new alliances. Again, the same pattern. Those who cling fall behind. Those who adapt move forward. And then something far more violent, the Black Death. A force so destructive it doesn't just collapse, economies it resets them. Entire populations vanish. Cities empty, fields go unworked. Labor, the backbone of the medieval economy, disappears almost overnight. To landowners, this is disaster. Their wealth was tied to land, but land without labor is worthless. And suddenly, the balance of power shifts. Workers once abundant and replaceable become scarce, valuable, powerful. Wages rise, conditions change. Social structures begin to fracture, and in the middle of devastation, a paradox emerges. Opportunity, not for everyone, but for those who could see beyond the immediate loss. Because, once again, value didn't disappear, it moved. Those who understood this, who renegotiated, who repositioned, found themselves in a new reality where the old rules no longer applied. And those who didn't, they waited, hoping the old system would return. It never did. Fast forward, the Great Depression, banks collapse, businesses fail, unemployment surges, entire communities are pulled into a downward spiral. To most people, this is pure loss. But look closer. Some farmers fail not because they lacked effort, but because they relied on traditional distribution systems that no longer worked. Others adapt. They change how they sell, how they distribute, how they think about value itself. Small shifts, but critical ones. And those shifts create a gap between those who see change and those who resist it. Then comes one of the most dramatic examples of all. The collapse of the Soviet Union, a system that appeared permanent, structured, controlled, predictable. Until suddenly, it wasn't. State-backed jobs disappear. Currency loses meaning. Institutions dissolve almost overnight. For millions, this is chaos, because their entire identity, their role, their security, their future, was tied to a system that no longer exists, but in the shadows. Another system had always been there, the black market, informal, flexible, adaptive, while official structures collapse. These underground networks expand. Why? Because they were never dependent on the system to begin with. They operated on something else: trust, relationships, adaptability, and when the formal system failed, they didn't need to adjust. They were already positioned. This is where the pattern becomes undeniable across centuries, across continents, across completely different types of collapse. The same truth repeats itself, not loudly, but consistently. During collapse, value does not vanish, it migrates. And the tragedy is not that people lose everything, it's that they hold onto definitions of value that no longer apply. They cling to land when mobility matters. They cling to currency when trust disappears. They cling to roles when systems no longer need them. And by the time they realize the shift, they are already behind. But here's the deeper question. If this pattern is so clear, if history has shown it again and again, why do most people still fail to see it in real time? Why do they stay anchored to systems that are already breaking? The answer is uncomfortable, because it's not about intelligence, it's about perception. In real-time collapse doesn't feel like collapse, it feels like normal life, with small inconsistencies. Prices rise slightly, opportunities shrink subtly. Structures feel a little less stable, but nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarm, and so people adjust. Just enough to cope, but not enough to change. They rationalize, they delay, they wait for certainty, but certainty never comes. Because by the time collapse becomes obvious, it's already complete. And that is the real danger. Not the collapse itself, but the blindness that precedes it. Because systems don't fail suddenly, they fail slowly, then all at once. And the difference between those who survive and those who don't is not who worked harder, not who was smarter, but who saw the shift before it became undeniable. Which leads to the next layer of this story. Because if collapse follows patterns, And if people consistently fail to recognize them, then something deeper is at play. Something beneath history itself, not events, not timelines, but mechanisms, forces that operate regardless of era, location, or system. To understand survival, we have to understand those forces, because once you see them, you don't just understand the past, you begin to recognize the future before it arrives. Collapse is rarely chaos. It feels like chaos when you're inside. It's confusing, unpredictable, overwhelming. But step back far enough, and something unsettling begins to emerge. A pattern, a structure, almost, a system behind the collapse itself. Because every collapse, no matter how different it appears on the surface, is driven by the same invisible forces, not events, forces. And once you see them, something shifts. You stop seeing collapse as random and start seeing it as inevitable. Every system, whether it's an empire, an economy, or a financial market, runs on one fundamental ingredient: trust, not gold, not currency, not even power. Trust. Trust that money will hold value. Trust that institutions will function. Trust that tomorrow will behave like today. And for a while, that trust is justified. Systems grow, they stabilize, they create predictability. But then something begins to happen beneath the surface. Pressure builds. Debt accumulates, not visibly at first, but structurally. Governments borrow, institutions expand. Promises are made that cannot be sustained indefinitely. Currency begins to stretch. More is created, not out of malice but necessity, to maintain growth, to preserve stability and institutions. They become heavier, slower, more complex, less adaptable. From the outside, everything still looks strong. Markets rise, economies expand, confidence increases. But this is where the first paradox emerges. Systems do not collapse when they are weakest. They collapse when they appear strongest. Because strength creates complacency. When things look stable, people stop questioning. They stop preparing. They stop adapting. Confidence delays reaction, and reaction, delayed long enough, becomes failure. This is the moment when collapse is already in motion but invisible to most, and then comes the second force: psychological inertia. Humans are not wired to respond to slow change. We are built for immediate threats, things we can see, touch, react to: a fire, a war, a sudden loss. But gradual decay, we ignore it, we normalize it. We tell ourselves it's temporary, that things will stabilize, that systems always recover, and sometimes they do, which makes the illusion even stronger. Because past recovery becomes proof of future safety. Even when the conditions have changed, this is why people don't move, not because they can't, but because they don't feel the urgency. Until it's too late, they anchor themselves to what has worked before. Jobs, systems, structures, they build identities around them, and this is where the third force begins to take hold. Specialization during periods of growth. Specialization is rewarded. The more focused your skill, the more valuable you become within the system. A banker becomes an expert in financial instruments. An engineer masters a specific technology. An employee optimizes for a narrow role within a larger machine. In stable conditions, this works. It creates efficiency, productivity, progress. But during collapse, specialization becomes fragility, because if the system that needs your skill disappears, so does your value. This is the hidden risk no one talks about. The more dependent your skill is on a specific system, the more vulnerable you are when that system changes, and systems always change. Meanwhile, there is another group operating differently, not better, not necessarily smarter, but differently. They are not defined by a single role. They are not anchored to a single system. They move between structures, they adapt, they connect. These are generalists, connectors, pattern thinkers. And during stability, they often appear less valuable, less efficient, less specialized. But during collapse, they become indispensable because they are not tied to what was. They are able to operate within what is emerging. This leads to a concept that almost no one considers until it becomes unavoidable: skill liquidity. Some skills are fixed. Others are fluid. A fixed skill is tied to a specific system. It works as long as that system exists. A fluid skill moves across systems. It adapts. It retains value regardless of context. Think about it. A job title has value only within a certain structure. A degree holds meaning only within a certain framework. But the ability to negotiate, to persuade, to identify patterns before they become obvious, to create value from limited resources, these are not tied to any one system. They are transferable. And in a collapsing environment, transferability becomes survival, because when one system fails, another begins to form. Always collapse is not the end of structure. It is the transition between structures, and those who survive are not those who hold on to the old system the longest. They are the ones who recognize the new one the fastest. Here's where it becomes even more uncomfortable. Most people today are deeply embedded in system-dependent roles. Careers built around stability, income streams tied to specific industries, identities shaped by predictable environments. And this creates a silent risk. Because when the system shifts, it doesn't ask for permission, it doesn't warn, it simply changes, and suddenly, the rules that once guaranteed success no longer apply. The strategies that once worked stop working. The paths that once led forward lead nowhere, and the question becomes immediate, not theoretical, immediate. What do you do when the system you depend on no longer supports you? Because at that point, knowledge is not enough. Information is everywhere, accessible, unlimited, but knowledge without adaptability is static, and static things break under pressure. This is why survival is not about what you know. It's about how you think, how quickly you can detach from outdated assumptions, how effectively you can reposition, how willing you are to let go of what no longer works, even when it wants to find you. And this is where most people fail. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they hesitate. They wait for confirmation. They look for certainty. But certainty is the first thing collapse removes. So those who wait for it are already behind. Meanwhile, those who act early before the shift is obvious gain something incredibly powerful. Time. Time to adapt. Time to a position. Time to align with the new structure before it fully forms. And in collapse, time is everything. Because once the shift becomes visible to everyone, it's already crowded. Opportunities shrink. Competition rises and the advantage disappears. This is why the most important skill is not technical. It's perceptual. The ability to see change before it becomes undeniable, to sense instability before it becomes visible, to question systems before they begin to fail. Because once you can do that, everything else changes. You stop reacting and start positioning. But there's one final layer to this, because in the past, collapse had boundaries: geographic, political, economic. Today, it doesn't. The forces that drive collapse are no longer contained within one system. They are interconnected. Global, which means when one system shifts, others follow faster than ever before. And that changes the nature of survival entirely, because now it's not enough to understand one system. Have to understand how systems interact, how they influence each other, how they fail together. And once you see that, you begin to realize something even more unsettling. The next collapse won't be isolated, it won't be contained, it will move quickly, seamlessly, across borders, industries, and structures, which raises a new question. In a world where everything is connected, where collapse spreads faster than awareness, what kind of skill remains stable? What ability holds value? No matter how many systems shift at once, the answer changes everything.